The smell of burnt transmission fluid and stale cigarettes clung to the inside of the truck. But it was the small, crumpled scrap of paper in Liz's hand that made her stomach turn. Outside, the neon sign of the Rusty Hook flickered, casting a rhythmic, sickly red glow over the dashboard. In the rearview mirror, a black sedan sat idling 50 yards back, its headlights extinguished like a predator waiting in the tall grass. Liz looked down at the note again. The jagged handwriting didn't just demand money. It promised a surgical kind of violence that her safety manuals never covered. A sudden, sharp, metallic thud echoed from the back of the parking lot, followed by the frantic shadow of her husband darting between rusted shipping containers. He wasn't heading toward the bar's entrance. He was meeting a man whose silhouette was twice his size and held a heavy, blunt object with practiced ease. Liz reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling against the cold steel. The engine of the black sedan behind her suddenly roared to life, the tires spitting gravel as it surged forward to block her exit. The safety of her structured world hadn't just cracked. It had shattered, and the jagged pieces were already drawing blood. The foreman's voice cracked under the weight of his excuses, fingers twitching toward the clipboard like a man reaching for a lifeline. "Karmichael, come on. You know how it is. Budget cuts, overtime, we're running on fumes here." His breath smelled of stale coffee and the metallic tang of the vending machine sandwiches he lived on. Liz didn't blink. The clipboard stayed pressed against her hip, her thumb tracing the edge of a dog-eared safety violation report. She let the silence stretch, let him sweat under the flicker of the overhead lights until his Adam's apple bobbed and he wiped his palms on his already grease-stained coveralls. A press hissed steam behind them, the sound swallowing the foreman's next words. Liz turned her head just enough to watch a rivulet of condensation slide down the machine's side, pooling on the concrete. The workers at the far bench had stopped pretending to work. One, young, acne-scarred, his gloves too big for his hands, shifted his weight from foot to foot, eyes darting between her and the foreman like he was calculating escape routes. She recognized the look. Fear, but not of her. Fear of what happened when the inspectors left and the foreman's temper took over. She tapped the clipboard against her thigh once, twice. The sound cut through the hum of the factory like a knife. "You want to tell me again how it is?" Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. The foreman's jaw tightened, but his shoulders slumped. He knew. They all did. The cracks in the safety glass weren't new. The missing guardrails, the unmarked spill hazards, the way the emergency exit door stuck after the last routine drill. Liz had seen it all before, in every plant from Detroit to Birmingham. The difference was, she never left without a name. The foreman exhaled through his nose, a wet, defeated sound. "Fine. I'll get maintenance on it by end of shift." Liz didn't nod, didn't smile. She just made another mark on the clipboard, this one slower, deliberate, and stepped past him, her boots leaving fresh prints in the oil-slicked floor. The young worker with the two big gloves flinched as she passed. She didn't look at him, but she made sure he heard her when she said, "Kid, gloves off, now." His hands jerked like she'd shocked him. The foreman opened his mouth to protest. Liz didn't wait to hear it. She moved through the Gary plant with the surgical precision of a woman who viewed chaos as a personal insult. The air here was a thick soup of graphite dust and oxidized iron, a scent that clung to her hair even after 3 washes. Liz pulled a white silk handkerchief from her pocket and ran it along the steel casing of a lathe. It came away streaked with a greasy, charcoal-colored residue. She stared at the stain, her jaw tightening. This wasn't just dirt. It was evidence of neglect, a slow-motion disaster waiting for a catalyst. The master of the shop floor scurried toward her, his voice a frantic pitch above the rhythmic thud of the hydraulic presses. He babbled about production quotas and the difficulty of sourcing replacement parts in a city that the rest of the country had forgotten. Liz didn't offer him the mercy of an interruption. She simply pointed a gloved finger at a hairline fracture spiderwebbing across a protective shield. She made a notation on her tablet, the stylus clicking against the screen with a finality that silenced the man's excuses. Gravel crunched under her heavy, steel-toed boots as she completed the perimeter check. The workers watched her, their eyes hooded with a mixture of resentment and exhaustion. She didn't mind. Safety was a god that demanded total devotion, and she was its high priestess. Every button on her navy work vest remained fastened, her spine a rigid line of defiance against the flickering, sickly yellow of the overhead fluorescent tubes. Order was the only thing standing between these men and the furnace. The drive home offered no respite. Gary drifted past her windows, a graveyard of industry where the skeletons of abandoned mills rose like jagged teeth against a bruised sky. When she stepped through her front door, the scent of lemon wax and cinnamon attempted to soothe her. But the atmosphere inside the house felt brittle. Jake was on the sofa, his large frame hunched over his smartphone, thumbs flying across the glass with a frantic energy. As soon as the floorboards groaned under her weight, Jake's posture shifted. He didn't look up. Instead, he fumbled with the device, the screen's glow vanishing an instant before he shoved it beneath a decorative pillow. He stared at the blank television screen, his shoulders rising toward his ears. "Jake?" she said, her keys still clutched in her hand. He didn't greet her. He didn't ask about the plant. He remained focused on the intricate, faded pattern of the rug, his breathing shallow. The silence in the living room grew heavy, a physical weight pressing against Liz's chest. She waited for him to speak, for the usual half-hearted joke or the complaint about his back. But he remained a statue of poorly concealed guilt. She moved to the kitchen, seeking the familiarity of her routines. The finance folder sat on the sideboard, a meticulously organized record of their survival. She began sorting through the utility bills and insurance renewals, her mind still tallying the violations at the plant, her fingers snagged on something unfamiliar, an envelope of heavy, cream-colored paper tucked behind their marriage certificate. Liz pulled it out. The paper felt thick, expensive, and entirely out of place in a house where every penny was accounted for. As she unfolded the sheet, her eyes landed on a red stamp that screamed, "Past due." The numbers followed, a 5-digit sum that made the room tilt. She traced the edges of the envelope, noticing the faint, sticky residue of glue. Jake had opened this, seen the destruction within, and tried to hide the evidence. Her vision blurred as she read the legal jargon. It spoke of liens, of the seizure of assets, of a debt incurred for home improvements that had never materialized. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in. A cold sweat broke across her forehead. She looked at the man in the other room, the man who was currently pretending to watch a dark screen, and realized she was living with a stranger. The next morning, the tension reached a breaking point. Jake was dressed for a shift he shouldn't have had, tugging on his heavy work jacket while avoiding the hallway mirror. "There's an extra night shift at the warehouse," he muttered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "They're behind on the inventory." Liz stood by the kitchen calendar. In the square for today, Jake's own handwriting clearly read, "Off." She traced the word with her thumb, the ink mocking her. She opened her mouth to challenge him, to demand he explain the 5-figure void in their bank account. But he was already bent over his boots, fumbling with the laces. The scent of his cheap cologne, usually a comfort, now smelled like a calculated distraction. He grabbed his keys without looking at her, his fingers trembling as they brushed the brass handle. He fled the house as if the walls were on fire. Liz stood in the empty hallway, the silence ringing in her ears. The faint smell of exhaust from his departing truck drifted through the door. She reached for his heavy winter coat, the one he'd left on the hook in his haste, planning to move it to the laundry room. The fabric was stiff with oil and road salt. As she carried it toward the machine, the metallic zip of a side pocket caught her attention. She reached inside, expecting a stray bolt or a crumpled receipt. Instead, her fingers closed around a jagged scrap of paper. She pulled it out. It was a leaf torn from a cheap spiral notebook, yellowed and stained. On it, a set of coordinates and the name of a bar. The Rusty Hook were scrawled in a frantic hand. Below that, written in the thick, aggressive strokes of a permanent marker, were words that stopped her heart. "Time's up, Jake. Pay, or we cut the whole family." The paper fluttered in her hand. The air in the laundry room felt thin, insufficient. She looked at the dirt on her palms, the grime from Jake's jacket, and didn't move to wash it off. The threat was no longer a distant possibility. It was in her house, etched in ink. She heard the rumble of an engine outside. Jake had forgotten his lunch, or perhaps his courage. Liz didn't think. She bolted for the driveway, the scrap of paper clutched in her fist. Jake's truck was idling, a cloud of blue smoke obscuring the rear lights. She slammed her fist against the driver's side window, pressing the note against the glass. Jake's face transformed. The guilt vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged mask of terror and fury. He didn't roll down the window. He didn't offer an explanation. Instead, his foot hit the floor. The tires shrieked against the asphalt, kicking up a spray of gravel that stung Liz's shins. She stumbled back, watching the red glow of his taillights vanish into the dusk. She returned to the house, but it wasn't a home anymore. It was a collection of objects. She sat on the edge of the sofa, staring at the books she had painstakingly alphabetized, the frames she had leveled with a spirit ruler. The order was a lie. Her father had died because of a single broken rule, and she had spent 30 years building a fortress of regulations to ensure it never happened again. Now, the fortress was made of cardboard, and the wind was picking up. The police were not an option. She knew the precinct in this district. Men who took their coffee with a side of apathy, who viewed the industrial zones as a lost cause. If she called them, Jake would be a statistic before the report was filed. She looked at the phone on the coffee table and let it stay there. Liz moved with a cold, mechanical purpose. She grabbed the keys to her own SUV. She checked her bag, wallet, a high-intensity flashlight, a heavy canister of industrial-grade mace, and a folding knife with a black oxide blade. She tested the edge. It was sharp enough to shave with. She adjusted her collar, hiding her face, and stepped out into the night, locking the door on the life she used to have. The drive into the industrial heart of Gary felt like a descent into a lower circle of hell. The manicured lawns of the suburbs gave way to the skeletal remains of the mills. The sky was a bruised purple, lit from below by the orange flare of the few remaining smokestacks. She didn't slow down for the potholes. She drove toward the flicker of a dying neon sign that pulsed like a failing heart. She killed the lights a block away, drifting into the shadows between two rusted shipping containers. From her vantage point, the entrance to the Rusty Hook looked like a wound in the side of a derelict brick building. Heavy, vibrating bass notes thudded against the air, making the SUV's windows shiver. Then she saw him. Jake was standing by the entrance, his posture slumped, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. A tall man in a leather trench coat emerged from the bar. His face was obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, but the gold ring on his hand caught the light as he reached out. Jake produced a fat envelope. Liz watched her husband's fingers cling to the paper for a fraction of a second too long before the man in the coat snatched it away. The man didn't look at the money. He weighed it in his hand, a mocking gesture, and then he laughed. A dry, rattling sound that carried over the wind. The violence happened in a heartbeat. The man in the coat didn't tuck the money away. He hissed something at Jake and then slammed the envelope back into Jake's chest. The force of the blow sent Jake staggering against the damp brick wall. The man followed, pinning Jake there with a heavy boot planted next to his head. Liz could see the man's jaw moving, a torrent of silent abuse directed at her husband. Jake didn't fight back. He looked like a man waiting for the axe to fall. Liz slipped out of her car, staying low, her boots silent on the cracked pavement. She moved toward a rusted dumpster that smelled of wet cardboard and rot. She pressed her back against the cold metal, her heart hammering against her ribs. The interest doesn't stop because your contractor skipped town, Jake, the man in the coat growled. His voice was surprisingly high, a sharp contrast to his physical presence. The house is the collateral. You don't have the cash? We take the wood and the bricks, and maybe we take the wife to make up the difference. Jake's voice was a pathetic whimper. The materials, the prices doubled. I just needed time. Liz felt a glass bottle crunch under her heel. She froze, her breath hitching. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet of the alley. The man in the coat paused, his head tilting like a predator catching a scent. He looked toward the dumpster. Liz squeezed her eyes shut, her hand gripping the mace canister so hard her knuckles ached. A stray cat darted from behind a pile of crates, screeching as it vanished into the darkness. The man laughed, a short, sharp bark. He turned back to Jake, giving him one final, violent shove. Midnight at the mill parking lot, the man said. The full amount, or we stop talking. Jake scrambled toward his truck, the engine screaming as he fled the scene. Liz waited, her lungs burning, as the man in the coat signaled to a black sedan idling in the depths of the alley. The car's headlights remained off, but the faint orange glow of a cigarette flickered behind the windshield. These weren't just thugs. They were a system. She didn't let them see her. She waited until the sedan glided away, before she sprinted back to her SUV. She followed at a distance, her lights off, relying on the ambient glow of the city to keep Jake's retreating truck in sight. The chase led them deep into the labyrinth of the steelworks. Gravel drummed against the underside of her car like machine gun fire. The black sedan appeared in her rearview mirror, a predatory shape that seemed to have materialized from the smog itself. They weren't following Jake anymore. They were following her. The sedan surged forward, its high-beam xenon lights blinding her. The car swerved, its metal flank grinding against her door with a shriek of tearing paint. Sparks danced in the dark. Liz fought the wheel, her muscles screaming as she tried to keep the SUV from flipping. The sedan surged again, cutting her off, forcing her to slam on the brakes. She skidded across the dirt, coming to a halt on the edge of a drainage ditch. She hit the lock button. Click, click, click. A massive man in leather gloves stepped out of the sedan. He didn't rush. He walked to her window and produced a handgun, using the heavy grip to tap rhythmically against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. He leaned in, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting her own terrified face. He smiled, showing a single iron-capped tooth. "You're a long way from the safety office, lady," he rumbled. Liz didn't scream. She didn't plead. She slammed the gear into reverse and floored it. The SUV lurched backward, the man jumping clear just before the front fender could take his legs. She spun the wheel, the tires biting into the dirt, and tore back toward the main road. She reached the house minutes before the sedan could catch her. She burst through the door, finding Jake in the living room. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was throwing clothes into a duffel bag, his movements jerky and panicked. "How much, Jake?" she demanded, her voice a whip crack. He didn't answer. He tried to push past her. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his bicep. "How much do you owe them?" "Everything," he roared, finally looking at her. His eyes were bloodshot, his face a ruin of shame. "I tried to fix the roof, the wiring. I thought I could flip the equity. It's gone, Liz. The money, the house, it's all gone." She pushed him back and opened her laptop on the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to use both to type the password. She logged into their joint account. The balance was a hollow, mocking zero. She scrolled through the history. Thousands of dollars bled out in increments, ending with a final, desperate transfer only hours ago. "You took the emergency fund," she whispered. "I thought I could win it back," he said, his voice breaking. "One night at the boat, I was so close." A screech of tires outside silenced them. The black sedan had found them. The white light of its headlights flooded through the curtains, stripping the room of its shadows. "Out the back," Liz commanded. She didn't wait for him to agree. She grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the kitchen exit. The sound of the front door splintering under a heavy shoulder echoed through the house. They reached the SUV just as the first of the men rounded the corner of the garage. Liz threw the car into gear, the engine howling as they tore through the backyard, over the neighbor's fence, and back onto the darkened streets of Gary. She drove with a cold, focused rage. She didn't head for the highway. She headed for the mill. The parking lot of the derelict steelworks was a wasteland of cracked concrete and rusted machinery. Liz killed the engine, the silence of the industrial graveyard settling over them. Above, the high-tension wires hummed with a low, predatory vibration. She turned to Jake. He was staring at his feet, the duffel bag clutched in his lap like a security blanket. She reached into her pocket and threw the crumpled thread at him. "You were going to let them kill us," she said. It wasn't a question. "I was going to fix it," he whispered. "You don't fix things, Jake. You break them and then you lie about the pieces." A shadow detached itself from the base of a massive cooling tower. The man in the leather coat stepped into the light of a single, flickering lamp. Behind him, his two shadows followed. One of them held a folding knife, the blade clicking into place with a sound that made Jake whimper. The man in the coat began to clap. Slow, rhythmic strikes of palm against palm. "Beautiful," the Rostovchik said. "The wife brings the lamb to the slaughter. I like a woman who understands efficiency," he signaled to the man with the knife. The thug walked to the front of Liz's SUV and drove the blade into the tire. The hiss of escaping air was the sound of their last escape route vanishing. The car tilted slowly, settling onto the rim with a heavy thud. Liz stepped out of the car. She didn't look at the knife. She didn't look at the gun tucked into the man's waistband. She reached into her bag and pulled out her industrial tablet. "You're Victor, right?" she asked. Her voice was steady. It was the voice she used when she was shutting down a multi-million-dollar production line. The man in the coat paused. "You know my name. That's a start." "I know a lot more than that," Liz said. She turned the tablet around. On the screen, a series of high-resolution photos displayed a hidden drainage pipe behind one of the warehouses Victor used as a front. "I'm a safety inspector, Victor. I spend my life looking for the things people try to hide. Like the fact that you've been dumping toxic runoff into the city's water table for 3 years to avoid disposal fees." Victor's smile faltered. "I have the soil samples," Liz continued, her finger hovering over the screen. "I have the GPS-tagged photos of your trucks at 3 in the morning, and I have an automated email script. If I don't check in every 12 hours, this entire file goes to the EPA, the FBI, and the local news. The man with the knife looked at Victor. The air in the parking lot felt thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and impending rain. You think you're the only one who can play with threats? Liz asked. Victor stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You're bluffing. Try me. I've spent 20 years enforcing rules on men who think they're above them. You're just another violation, Victor, and I never leave without a name. She pulled up a document on the screen, a structured repayment plan. Here is how this is going to work. You're going to take the money Jake already gave you as the first installment. The rest will be paid over 36 months. No interest, no penalties. You will sign this digital agreement as a private loan. And if I just kill you both now, then the email goes out in 6 hours, and you spend the rest of your life in a federal cell for environmental crimes and racketeering. Is Jake's debt worth that? Victor stared at her for a long time. The wind picked up, whistling through the empty skeletons of the mill. Finally, he reached out and took the stylus she offered. He signed the screen with a jagged, angry flourish. 36 months, he spat. 1 day late and the deal is off. I don't care about the EPA when I'm burning your house down. He turned and signaled to his men. They melted back into the shadows, the black sedan's engine roaring to life in the distance. Liz stood in the center of the empty lot, the tablet heavy in her hand. She turned to the car. Jake was still sitting there, his face buried in his hands. Get out, she said. He scrambled out, looking at the flat tire. Liz, I didn't know you had all that. I didn't, she said, her voice flat. The soil samples were just photos of rust. But men like him always assume everyone is as dirty as they are. She threw the jack at his feet. Fix the tire. She watched him work. She watched him struggle with the lug nuts, his hands shaking, his face smeared with grease and shame. She didn't offer to help. She stood over him with her flashlight, the beam steady and unforgiving. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, a pale, sickly yellow struggling against the Gary smog. When the tire was finally changed, they drove home in a silence that felt permanent. Inside the house, Liz didn't go to bed. She sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. She took photos of Jake's pride and joy, the blue pickup truck he'd spent every weekend polishing. She listed it for sale at a price that guaranteed a buyer by noon. That was my father's truck, Jake whispered from the doorway. It's the first payment, Liz said, not looking up. And tomorrow, you're taking the shift at the foundry. I spoke to the foreman. It's 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Liz, there are no more plans, Jake. There are no more ideas. There is only the schedule. You will work, you will bring me the check, and I will manage the accounts. She looked at him then. The man she had loved was still there, somewhere under the layers of lies and weakness. But the woman who had trusted him was gone. The rules are what keep us alive, she said, her voice echoing in the quiet kitchen. And from now on, I'm the one who writes them. She closed the laptop. Outside, the first whistle of the morning shift at the mill sounded. A long, mournful wail that signaled the start of a very long, very hard day. Liz stood up, adjusted her collar, and began to make the coffee. The order had been restored, but the cost was written in the lines of her face, a debt that would take a lifetime to pay.